Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Stuart Vyse. He's a behavioral scientist, teacher, and writer. He taught at Providence College, the University of Rhode Island, and Connecticut College. Vyse's book, Believing in Magic, The Psychology of Superstition, won the 1999 William James Book Award of the American Psychological Association. And he's a contributing editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, where he writes the behavior and belief column, and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. His newest book, out now, is called The Uses of Delusion: Why It's Not Always Rational to Be Rational. Welcome, Stuart.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so before we begin, I want to read a pretty epic passage from Stuart's book. So Stuart writes, Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey into English begins with the line, quote unquote, "Tell me about a complicated man." Odysseus was a complicated man, and one of the goals of this book has been to remind us that we are all complicated people. We are a mixture of reason and magical thinking, intelligence and emotion. When Camus said, quote unquote, "Ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it out with the stroke of a pen," he was talking about the burdens of consciousness and knowing what we know about life and death. But this book is meant to suggest that we are not in opposition to creation at all. Granted, we are not trees among trees or cats among animals, but we are just as much a part of nature as they are. Furthermore, some of what keeps us going is much older than the ridiculous reason we got in the cognitive revolution. Natural selection is the ultimate pragmatist. It brings to each species whatever characteristics will get it to the next day. Wow. Okay, so love that. And then, so if we think about reason, right, we often think about it as an opposition to emotions or system one thinking, right? So we tend to put system two thinking in a pedestal, and we think of it as a way of, in terms of the opposition, we think of it in terms of like a battle where we have to sort of like, let's say, cultivate one as opposed to the other. But in your book, you talk about the uses of what I guess some people will call delusional thinking, which is, again, so contrary to what we think about in academia, maybe even in psychotherapy. A lot of my clients, when they come to therapy, they want to learn how to kind of subdue their emotions and kind of maintain a dominant level of control over them. But can you tell us about now, kind of your understanding and your research, why delusional thinking can be sometimes good and pragmatic and beneficial?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you it's always wonderful for an author to hear his words coming back at him. So thank you for reading that section. And it is near the end of the book and summing things up. I come at this from a history, as you know, as your introduction of me might suggest, of rational thinking, of the idea being that reason is king, and that we should always be rational and reasonable. But in my work, and much of my time I spent on superstition, I kept bumping up against things that were clearly irrational, and yet benefited people. And so this book is sort of acknowledging that, acknowledging that we are complicated people, that we are not just, we are not just trying our best to be reasonable all the time, that there are things that are unreasonable and don't make sense in terms of the rational choice model, that still help us. So I'm very happy that you connected with it and that you appreciated it. But we are benefited by system one, as you say. This is making use of the Kahneman and Tversky sort of system one and system two. Obviously, from an efficiency point of view, if you can make quicker judgments, fast judgments with system one, that's going to be helpful. But this book actually goes beyond that to suggest that there are some things that we are drawn to do for whatever reason, that are not rational, not entirely rational, and yet clearly benefit us. And so I'm sure we'll get into the more specific examples so that people can know what we're talking about. But it's clearly true. And so this is sort of a for me, an act of humility. After having sort of beat the drum of rationality for much of my career, this is like stepping back and sort of correcting the balance and recognizing that we are a mixture of, as I say, reason and magical thinking, and that sometimes the magical thinking actually helps. And it doesn't mean everybody will always be able to use all the things that are in the book. As you know, some of them are specific to certain people and not to everyone. But for those who do use them in their lives in the right circumstances, it's clear that they help.
Right. Yeah, and it's like when you think about some of, I guess some of like delusional thinking, and then when we let me just actually give a kind of an example. So when you think about delusional thinking, we always think about sort of how it's detrimental to relationships. So an example that comes to mind is so I know somebody who's currently in couples therapy, and then so when he's trying to attempt to talk to his partner about the sort of different ways that they disagree, and sort of maybe the different things that the partner, kind of the missteps that this person takes in their relationships, or in their relationship, the partner kind of like, she gets really defensive. She's really hurt, gets really offended even, and she says, I'm not doing anything wrong. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not a bad person, right? So when we think about it that way, right, it kind of like you can see how that's sort of toxic to a relationship, and you can obviously see how he's upset and he's like, I don't really understand, what's going on with this person. I'm not really even sure how to make it work. But when you kind of like put another sort of spin on it and how we use delusional thinking and love, you actually say it's pretty natural, right? Because for him, I could see how he would get offended and he would say, well, this person clearly doesn't care about me, right? But that's not the only story of delusional thinking and love. And I don't know, I guess love comes to mind because it's so prevalent, and I would think that delusional thinking is so prevalent in love. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the benefits of delusional thinking and love, as opposed to just, let's say getting defensive and saying, well, I'm never wrong, or I'm right 90% of the time, this is all your fault, etc.
Yeah, like the belief in a soulmate for
Right.
instance, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I really enjoyed writing that chapter, and I'm happy to say that that I've gotten a fair amount of positive feedback about it. But it turns out that in many love relationships, if it's a tit for tat sort of thing, like you do the dishes and I'll vacuum, the house, that's not a formula for success. That what does work, and so it's sort of like if you approach being married or in a relationship as being like an economic thing where both sides get benefits and it's a trade-off, that's likely to fail. And it is true that that people want to hear something more than that. They want to believe that, and there's an example, of course, involving my own life that I describe in the book. But people want to hear more than just, hey, this is a good thing and I'm going to do the best I can. They want to hear that we are soulmates, that there's something special about our relationship that wouldn't be true if we were with other people. And so I tell the story in my at the beginning of that chapter, if you'll indulge me, where I was in a relationship with a woman, and as far as I knew, we were both very much in love, and I was having a conversation with her, and I happened to say, I was actually going somewhere else in the conversation, but on the way there, I happened to say, but of course, given all the millions of people in the world, there are probably any number of people we could have found that we would be equally as attached to and in love with. Like, the conversation ended at that moment because she objected to that idea strenuously and did not want to hear that. She wanted to hear that there was something unique and special about our relationship. And in the end, that relationship actually didn't survive. So she may have been onto something. And there is good research that suggests that among marriages and that people who have an overly idealistic view of their partner, right, and they've come up with clever ways to figure that out in the research, but people who have overly idealistic views of their partner are happier, and the couples that share that kind of thing are happier than those who don't. So far, the evidence does not say that it prevents divorce. So divorce may be, dependent upon other issues, but within the context of an ongoing relation, and it's not just at the beginning. They've done studies over time to show that continues to be the case over time. And so it shows that that's the case. I also talk about, the marriage vow, right? So in many cases, there is a, Christian marriages in particular, they still sometimes have this phrase, I promise to love and, until death do us part, right? Mm. Well, I mean, the person saying that, unless they've been living in a tunnel their whole lives, knows that half marriages fail, right? And so to make that promise is a little bit tricky to do. And so in other words, in a way, you either have to be sort of ignoring the data and fibbing when you make that promise, or you're just, being unrealistic. You're not being rational. And so the rational vow would be like, I really love you right now, and I'll do my best. I'm going to do my best to make sure that this lasts as long as I like it. I would like it to last as long as possible. And so once you say those words out loud, you realize how flat that's going to land, that people are not going to be satisfied with that. I mean, even if you attended a wedding and you were in the audience and the groom or one of the participants said, well, I really love you. I'm going to do my best, and withholds the promise to love you forever, essentially, right? It's not going to be very good. So it's an interesting thing. We lovers need to have something more than just like, this is great, we're good, this is a nice thing. And I think there's some reasons for that. I think that once you've established that the relationship is a soulmate relationship or a special relationship, then it makes it means, if you talk yourself into that, it means that other people are going to be less attractive. So the idea of being unfaithful somehow is demoted, right? Because you're not going to get that special thing, right. Unlike what I said to my partner at the time, if it's a soulmate relationship, then there's sort of a guarantee that straying is not going to get you anything as good as what you have now. And so it's an interesting thing, and I think people reading this chapter have been very quick to recognize that there is some irrationality. There's also, and I don't want to go on too long if you
please
stop. But the act of falling in love in the first place, right, is also not necessarily a rational thing, right? Most people say that they fall in love at first sight, right? Or that, many people do. And so whatever that attraction is, it's not, somebody with a calculator making some kind of an economic, decision. It's something else. And so, it's interesting that this is an area where clearly, whether it's a good thing or not, that we just sort of fall for someone when we fall in love. I'm not sure. I'm not prepared to say that that's a good thing or not, but it seems to be a fact for many people that they're not sort of sitting there with a spreadsheet and thinking, well, there's Joe and there's Jill and there's, who should I, there's, points of comparison and so forth. It's not like shopping for a refrigerator, it's something different.
Yeah. And then so when I think about it, it's kind of interesting because then it goes into the topic of motivation. So I mean, I want to know what it's like for you guys in terms of this too. So when I'm trying to motivate myself to do something, I tend to actually idealize whatever the goal is. So whether it's a prospective partner or let's say whether even it's the podcast, right? Whether it's, my own writing, whatever it is, I often idealize like what that vision is like. It's sort of like the Great Gatsby syndrome, where it's like, if it's not amazing, you kind of don't want to do that. So, and I wonder if it's the same thing with love. I'm sure like anxiety, safety is a component of it too. But I wonder with love, it's like we can't get ourselves to motivate ourselves to take that kind of risk unless we believe the reward is immense. So I wonder if that's again, I want to hear your perspective too, but I wonder, Stuart, it's like, that's some of what you see in the research, that when people do think about love, it's like, it's not worth pursuing unless it's amazing, because there's so much risk involved and there's so much effort involved, and even potential, obviously, just heartache in the kind of intermittent period as you are seeing. seeing the person? I mean, because, people let you down, people disappoint you. Is it that the only way for us to stay motivated and to even get motivated, is the only way for us to do that is to idealize whatever that end goal is?
Yeah, I think that is part of it for many people. Some people in reacting to the chapter have brought up the possibility that when people start a relationship, sometimes they sort of hold back, right? Because they are worried about being hurt, right? And I don't really address that in the book, but I think that the fear of being hurt is something that can change what I'm talking about. In other words, the sort of falling immediately in love, which I think is probably more common, but nonetheless both are common. That's the clearly yielding to an irrational impulse, or not irrational necessarily in a bad way, because love seems to be a positive thing, but not using reason, not using rationality to make that judgment. But there are people who, and this sort of goes back to, in a different chapter, I talk about defensive pessimism.
Right.
So for some people, I think there is a sort of, at the beginning of a relationship, there may be a kind of defensive pessimism where they say, I really like this person, but I'm going to take it slow and I'm not going to get hooked because, and so on. And that's a whole different thing. But the chapter that I'm writing about, the soulmate chapter, is primarily about the people who leap, at the beginning and get into it. But I think your point is valid. I think that is true of some people as well.
Right. And it's like, and I wonder, and then again, asking you, right? Yeah. Can I just ask you the question to get you to answer it? Right. So, okay. When you kind of envision goals or love or whatever it is, right? Do you feel like you actually need to put it up on the pedestal, either to feel safe or whatever else, but in order to just genuinely pursue it?
Well, I'll be honest, in my experience, what I've done is I tend to fall in love very quickly, actually. And to my detriment. It kind of reminds me of your chapter, or where you speak about having a sort of a dangerous overconfidence versus a helpful overconfidence.
Oh.
And yeah, so in my experience, has been kind of that,
I think
probably
I'm
that dangerous.
Or
Oh, can you hear us now? Oh,
there.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh, great.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I was just saying that in my experience, by falling in love too quickly, I probably been at that spectrum of sort of having that dangerous overconfidence, probably, versus that helpful overconfidence. And I was wondering if maybe, if it's all right with you, if we could sort of highlight the differences, like what is the distinction between having a sort of dangerous overconfidence versus a helpful overconfidence?
Good. Yeah. So this is a separate chapter, and I put it into the situation of, for example, in business or your work, or various contexts like that, and also in sports. So I do separate out certain areas where it's dangerous. So one of the things, interestingly, Daniel Kahneman was asked, as I mentioned in the book, what human bias would you want to eliminate the most? And he said overconfidence. But I think he was thinking about it, and it's interesting, that's not necessarily consistent with some of the other things he's written about overconfidence. But I think one of the things that he was thinking about was the crash, was the 2008 crash. People were overconfident about their ability to pay mortgages. Bankers were overconfident about how they thought they had controlled the risk in certain kinds of investments and so on. And so I think that's it. And I would say that in keeping with that the dangerous places for overconfidence are at the beginning of an enterprise, especially one that potentially has a big downside. So starting a business at the beginning, or in the worst case scenario, starting a war, right? Mm-hmm. Where clearly there's a huge downside. So many wars seem to have been recently started with the idea that, oh, this will be a cakewalk, this will be easy, and within 20 years later you're still slogging away, right? And so but in a more real world situation, like starting an enterprise, your own business or something, that's when probably coldly rational thinking, maybe even a little bit pessimistic thinking about how it could fail, and what the problems were that would develop, that's probably a moment when that is actually better. But that doesn't come up that often. In other words, you only launch big, worrisome things once in a while in your life. On a day-to-day basis, when you're in the daily slog of just coming to work and doing your stuff, that's where overconfidence, I think, really can benefit you, because it will keep you motivated, keep you going. You mentioned the idea that the goal is really shiny and attractive. That's the kind of thing that on a day-to-day basis is going to get you up in the morning and keep you going. And if you're actually a leader, if you're the boss or supervising a group of people, that overconfidence can be contagious. And they're like, he believes in it. I believe in it too, and so on. So I think that's the sort of difference you were asking about. When is it good? When is it not good? And so on. I also talk about competitive situations like sports. That in those cases, if you are overconfident, obviously sometimes your overconfidence is going to be slammed anyway. You're still going to lose, right? But if you can be solidly overconfident, that actually does help. There's good evidence to that people who are confident about their abilities at the beginning of an enterprise, even when they're underdogs, that can help. And I talk about, for example, athletes who have tantrums, like McEnroe or once in a while Djokovic will also. I watch a fair amount.
Yeah, Tom Brady too.
Yes, exactly. But and the commentators will say, oh well, he's psyching himself up. It's usually he's psyching himself up. This is the way he deals with it. But my feeling is that ignores the person at the other end of the court, right? That if I were playing a player and they burst out, breaking their racket and so forth, I would feel great about that. That would really encourage me. Like, I've got this guy going off now. And so the evidence, I believe the evidence suggests that if you want to be competitive, you should be like a cyborg. Just keep coming, even when you're down. Just keep coming at him. I tell the story about Ivan Lendl beating McEnroe for the first time in tennis, and he, of course, had that reputation of just always coming at you, just very low emotion, and just coming like a zombie. And so, no one wants to be a cyborg or a zombie on a daily basis, but in competitive situations, I think it can help.
Right. Yeah, and sort of fusing these two ideas together, it also seems like in order for us to maintain some level of confidence, well, actually, let me just give an example. So I remember when I still sort of do this to this day, but when I was like a teenager, and let's say, going back to this idea of love, I would like not only just idealize the person, but I would idealize like my confidence and my ability in that relationship. So if you think about the way that we conceive of destiny, it's not just that like, hey, this person is amazing. It's also that I'm meant to be with this amazing person. So when we think about managing our emotions, and again, building confidence, obviously, that sort of conception of, okay, not only is this goal worth it, but I'm also capable of achieving it. It sort of like puts you in this kind of euphoric state where like, this is just meant to be, right? And it's like, not only can you motivate yourself to pursue it, but again, all of the anxiety or fear around it, it sort of withers away. But obviously, what happens to me, or what happened to me, and what happens to, anybody who kind of has that perceived state, is essentially it kind of all falls apart. And a lot of what I deal with in therapy is people who are like addicted to love, where for them, they kind of go into these states pretty, like Alan would say, like, he falls in love quickly, and then it sort of falls apart because you don't really know the person. It's not really destiny, obviously. And then what happens is not only are you let down, but you're devastated, because it's like where your ideal is, it's so far down from what reality brings you. And if you're okay with my asking, because I really wanted to kind of get into this a little bit with you, but is that kind of what it's like for you when you fall away from that state? Just curious.
Well, yeah. Well, what's interesting is, yes, once that delusion is broken, essentially, it's very disheartening, right? And it makes one tend to want to be sort of defensively pessimistic moving forward. And I kind of do default to that lately. The thing is, though, on one level, being defensively pessimistic has led me to imagine every single possible scenario, right? And sort of deal with it before dealing with it and remove some of the anxiety that I might experience from the unknown, right? And in many ways, it's very helpful to me. In other ways, it's like a double-edged sword. Weirdly enough, by imagining every scenario, yes, once I encounter it, I know how to deal with it. But also by imagining every scenario as well, I'm kind of overthinking, and that may come off in my behavior or my actions. And then the other person's kind of thinking, whoa, this guy is really overthinking this. He can't just be in the moment and go with the flow. Right. And so I kind of go between the two extremes. Like I could go with the flow, but then overdo it. Or maybe I will imagine every scenario and kind of navigate, but then I don't know, something isn't quite clean about that action, if that makes any sense.
Right. It's sort of like you go crashing down, right? It's like when the ideal is broken, it falls apart, right?
Not always. I mean, sometimes it goes well too. I mean, let's not, honestly, the defensively pessimistic strategy a lot of times works in my favor. Right. And then I could sort of switch between that and then being in the moment, ideally when I can.
Yeah.
But it is a challenge. It's definitely a challenge.
Right. It is a challenge. Yeah. And the thing is that I appreciate that very much, that maybe if you think of the analogy to starting a business, right? Falling in love like starting a business, in some ways, although it's not, I mean, there are so many people who just sort of, and of course there's all this physical stuff as well involved, which is not rational necessarily. And but if you think about it, if you were to sort of, prior to being committed, think about this, say, okay, this is what I know about this person. I mean, sometimes you can't know, right? I mean, that's the problem. You have a lack of information at the beginning, but you might, if there was a way to sort of do that defensive pessimistic thing at the beginning, or, do that non-overconfident thing at the beginning, as you would in starting a business. And then once you decide to take the step, you go fully into the soulmate realm, then perhaps you would have protected yourself, to some degree. But during the ongoing relationship, there is evidence that, that the more unrealistic sort of we're special aspect is valuable. And so at that point, too bad, you're going to get your heart broken, if it goes south at some point. So there's a balance that I suspect you're trying to achieve, and it makes sense.
Right. And then the question is, it's like, okay, I could see it from an evolutionary perspective, because if, let's say, like mating is pretty short term. And then, it takes like, let's say 9 months of incubation in terms of having a baby. And then, really for protection, the baby only needs to be protected for about like 4 years. And then, the father can, hypothetically sort of move on. Right. But I wonder if that's not the society that we have, right? If we're for the most part pretty monogamous and we do want to develop long-term relationships, how can that, if at all, how can that delusion become useful to us? Because it seems like, especially even with what you're saying, is that once it falls apart, it's devastating. So it doesn't go from here to here, it goes from here to here, right? So it's like, how do we go from the point of like, okay, yes, okay, I get it, maybe we're not soulmates, but I still really like you and I want to be with you? Is that possible, or is it just inevitable that once you have that soulmate delusion, it's always a crash, and then there's always devastation, and then the relationship is just bound to fall apart?
Yeah. I mean, this is beyond, I think I'm purely speculating here, but I think that, of course, it, as they say about raising kids, it's good to have backup, to just, it's a big job. I've done it. And as a husband, as a parent, but so anything that maintains that relationship over time is good. That there are weird evolutionary psychology theories about how men excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink of water.
Sure. I'll take a sip of coffee.
Yeah. How men can stray, and that there might be an evolutionary reason for that. But I think that's, I mean, we're all beyond that now. But I do think that once the soulmate thing is going, and it is going in your relationship, there may be moment to moment benefits, and a lot of the things in the book seem to be sustained by the immediate effects and obviously in the soulmate case, I think the effects are immediate and day to day, right? Whereas the crash, if it fails, is a one-time big hit that you're going to have to take. Sometimes people, though, by the time they split, they're no longer in that soulmate thing, especially in the case of marriages. I mean, if you're married or if you have kids, sometimes they grind along, unpleasantly for quite a while, and then they let it go. So it's a different kind of loss in that case than what we're talking about here. So it varies depending upon the nature of the relationship, I would suspect.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of defensive pessimism. So first of all, Alan, I want to ask you how that works, like for you, if it does work at all. And then Stuart, I want to actually ask you in terms of like the research, what does the research tell us about defensive pessimism in terms of its usefulness, right? So when it can be used, how it's used, and when it's beneficial as opposed to not. But when does it work for you, if at all?
Well, for sure, when it comes to managing expectations in a relationship. So let's say I met somebody, I'm going on a date for the first time, right? So I'm not immediately, I mean, this is as opposed to what I was mentioning earlier, where I might fall in love quickly. I'm not there yet, right? I'll say, okay, there are many candidates out there, many girls that, I could potentially fall in love with. So making the one that I'm about to see and, putting them on a pedestal, so to speak, and making them the most special, may not be good in terms of how I'm gonna behave towards them. Maybe making it seem like I have a healthy view of how this could go. Maybe this won't turn into anything. Maybe that behavior will come off. She'll sort of feel that I'm not sold immediately. Maybe she also has to invest something.
Your value goes up.
In a sense, I'm not immediately investing everything in her. I'm allowing also maybe the opportunity for her to invest as well.
Right.
By me over investing, maybe that's not attractive. Like, whoa, why is this person into me so quickly?
Right.
I haven't done anything for them to like me yet. And maybe being a little coy allows for her to feel like, okay, maybe I should do something as well to maybe get my attention or something like that.
Right.
There's that. Or maybe, for example, let's say in terms of the podcast, let's forget relationships for a moment. Let's say we had a guest scheduled, maybe let's say it was for last week. And we think they're going to come on at this time and we're going to meet with them. And I prepare myself saying, they may come on, they may not. I mean, ideally they should. We've discussed this. It should happen. It should work out. But if they don't, I won't be upset if they don't, because if hypothetically, if I wasn't prepared for that scenario and then it occurred, I would be upset. My emotions would be lowered. I'd be disheartened. It might lead to another action where I feel less optimistic about the podcast and sort of where it's heading. And that can create a sort of downward spiral. And so by preparing for a possible negative, negative result, I can, deal with that beforehand and not feel as bad. And my emotions aren't lowered as much.
Right.
I can continue moving forward and believing in our purpose and goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hear. Stuart?
Yeah. So the defensive pessimism is defined as being sort of overly negative in your prediction, despite a previous history of success, right? And I talk about it in the health chapter, and I also talk about an example in my own life, which was that, I'll start there, that when I first got a tenure track job at a liberal arts college, I was very excited. It was a wonderful place and, very fancy. And I had, I'd been a public school kid and I had gone to state universities, whereas many of my students were like, they had gone to boarding schools. This is an expensive place. They'd gone to boarding schools or private schools. My colleagues, some of them went to Harvard and Yale, the other faculty members. So I was like, this is a really cool place and I would love to be able to stay here, but don't get used to it, right? Don't get connected to it because you have to earn tenure. And if you don't get tenure, you have to leave, right? That's the way it works, is that it's up or out. And so I said, I very consciously adopted this sort of distanced attitude, not unlike yours with the podcast guest, right? But where I said, don't get used to it because, and the idea being that I would be so crushed, right, if I didn't get tenure. And I think it worked for me, and I did work very hard, and I did get tenure. But the funny downside of it was that once I got tenure, I couldn't immediately embrace the place. I couldn't shake. I'd been doing it for such a long time, this distancing thing. And it took me about a year to sort of get rid of it and say, come to think of it, you really do belong here and you're just as good as anyone else. And so it's an interesting thing. And it is true that the thing about defensive pessimism is that it protects you from, its goal is to protect you from hurt, right, with the future. But in the moment, it doesn't feel very good. It would be, I lost in a sense, right? I lost about 6 years when I could have been sort of embracing the place and enjoying it to the hilt, right? In fact, I lost more than that because I couldn't shake it, but that's the deal. In the health area, the example that I give, it's very practical, the irrational behavior with respect to health in some cases can be useful. And though it's again nuanced, like the overconfidence one. But defensive pessimism in health, interestingly, long before the coronavirus, our coronavirus, there were studies in Asia of people when other pandemics that didn't come to our town, were involved because they had prior experience with SARS-1 and all those things, and it turned out that people who were defensively pessimistic, I think this is a study done in Japan, were defensively pessimistic about the virus, that they thought they were going to get it, right? They were much more likely to do protective things like wearing masks and washing their hands and all that sort of thing in advance of the coming thing, right? Whereas people who were overly confident or more confident did not. And so there's a benefit. Again, it's not pleasant to be that way, to think I'm going to get it and so on, and in the moment. But in terms of actually doing positive things to avoid getting sick, there was that benefit, and so that was good. The paradigm shifts when you're sick. You've lost your status quo of health. You're below where you want to be. At that point, pessimism is not going to be of value, right? Then you're just going to accept your illness. You're not going to do anything. Here's where confidence and overconfidence is going to get you to do the rehab that you need to do, to cope with it better and so forth. And so it depends on it depends on the circumstance, but that defensive pessimism is of value with an oncoming, and you can remember what it was like when the COVID started to come to town. There were some people who were very cautious and they did all the things. And today, some of them have not ever gotten COVID as a result of it. Whereas other people were much more, oh, it's no big deal, let's go. And they got it, so.
Right. Right. And then even now thinking about it in terms of personality, we always tend to think of people as being either really pessimistic or really optimistic, just like we think of like with the Myers-Briggs test, right? We think that people are extroverts, introverts, etc. But if you really think about it, I mean, like even with Alan, right? So I mean, it's easy to kind of say that, like, based on what you talk about, usually I would say, okay, well, Alan seems to be really optimistic, right? Based on just the conversations that he and I have. But if you didn't know this other side of him, right, you would think, oh, well, no, he's actually like, oh, I'm sorry, if you did know this other side of him, you would think, oh, no, wait, actually, no, it's the opposite. It actually sounds like he's actually pretty pessimistic. So can we talk about a little bit in terms of what the self is, and that you can't actually pin down people's personalities, although obviously in terms of the delusion, it's very easy to see it that way. So if, let's say, I spoke to Alan for about, I don't know, 15 minutes, I would say to myself, Alan seems really optimistic, right? As compared to like the norm, Alan's level of optimism is up here and people are maybe somewhere in the middle, or I don't know, maybe I think about it just in extremes in general. But the self itself, right? We tend to make these predictions based on these very limited data points on who and what we think of the other person. And we tend to think we know them, when again, it's like if I thought I knew Alan and then he said, oh, well, actually, no, after, the delusion kind of fades away, I become super pessimistic. It's sort of like mind blowing. You're like, wait, you're not the type of person I thought you were. I thought you were supposed to be optimistic. How are you handling this well now?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's because you don't know him in that context, in that environment, right, or whatever. Yeah. So I have a whole chapter that you're alluding to about the personality and the self, and this has been a hotly debated thing in psychology. There's the primary way in which people think of personality now is this 5-factor trait theory, where people are introverted, extroverted, all the different 5 traits, and that's thought to be a fairly stable thing throughout the lifespan, right? And even across environments. But the interesting thing about that is that it historically and up to this moment, it has been designed to be specifically not reflective of any moral aspect of the person, any their ethical nature and so forth. And yet the interesting thing is that what we seem to care most, at a base level about people is, can I trust you? Are you someone that I can be with and know what to expect from you in the future and so forth? And those things, that's really been in an interesting way, which I talk about in the book, has been relegated to the field of social psychology. Social psychology's history, in some ways is deeply rooted in the civil rights movement, in the Holocaust, and other things that people wanted to understand. How could people be so horrible to one another and so forth? And so I talk about the Milgram research that shows that huge numbers of people will, under the right circumstances, with an authority figure standing over them, will give 500-volt shocks to a person with a heart condition, right? And sadly, that research has held up. That it's been replicated, and it had to be done somewhat differently because our ethical standards about what we can do in research have changed. But basically, the results seem to be the same, and there's very little difference between men and women in their willingness to do this to other people. So much of social psychology suggests that we are strongly influenced by the situation we're in, by the immediate setting and the demands of that setting, and that any number of us are capable of, it's not a happy message, right? But that any number of us are capable of difficult, of bad and horrible acts. I use, as sort of a classic example of that in the book, I use the case of Patty Hearst, Patricia Hearst, who was an heiress. She was the heir to the Hearst newspaper fortune, and she was a happy little heiress at the beginning. In her teens, she was kidnapped by a bunch of radicals called the Symbionese Liberation Army, and they treated her fairly harshly at the beginning of her time. They kept her in a closet for about a couple of months, and they bombarded her with propaganda and stuff. But ultimately, she became a member of the group, and she participated in a bank robbery and other illegal activities, and she she had many opportunities when she could have left the group, and she didn't.
Mhm.
And so you know, she literally changed from an heiress into a gangster in the course of just a few months. And there's no evidence that she would have quit, except for the fact that she was captured. And then suddenly she returns to her heiress status, because again, now the situation is such that if she doesn't take on the sweet, you know, sort of image of the heiress, the victim, then she's going to get a very bad prison term. And so she's I mean, obviously it's just one case, and it's a very unique one, but it does sort of demonstrate the degree to which we can be molded. And the idea that we have a consistent personality that can be trusted is more of an aspect of luck, in my view, than it is of anything really dependable in that same way.
Right. So it's like in extreme situations, not only can people change, but also sometimes people want to change. So it's not as though, I would say, it doesn't seem like she was brainwashed just based on the evidence. Whatever that even honestly is, I don't really even know scientifically what we would, well, how do we even label what brainwashing is? But the idea there is that like there was a part of her that like sort of was attracted to these people. And the reason why she was there at these steakhouses, or no, it's not steak. What am I saying? Steakhouse. The reason why she was staking out and like, yeah. And so, and the reason why she was shooting at other innocent people is literally because she wanted to do it. But it's so interesting that it kind of works that way, because you would never expect that from somebody, again, that you think you have a consistent like information or knowledge base on.
Right. And yeah, and there are, you know, I also talk about, like, you know, every time there's not every time, but many times if there's a shooting or a murder, right, you get this person on the street interview of the neighbor said, well, he just seemed like a normal person to me, you know, and it didn't, you know, whatever. That's not always the case, obviously, but especially with these really bad shootings that we've had lately. But you know, that people are capable of unpredictable behavior if they're put in that right circumstance. And so and at the same time, you know, as the consumer of other people, right, we need to believe, right, that, you know, the two of you need to believe that you can count on each other, and that you know, that things will happen predictably. Without that, then, you know, you wouldn't feel good about going on with the enterprise. And so it's an interesting thing that I believe that it is sort of a delusion, that, you know, it's not a given in the way that we think about it. But I understand why we need to think about it that way, and that we need to be able to trust each other, and so on.
Right. Alan told me once something really important where, so because like I struggle with anxiety, I'm actually very rigid oftentimes in my thinking. So for me, when I think of people, I like to tell myself that I know who they are. So like often when I'll like complain about somebody to Alan, I'll be like, okay, this is why I don't like this person. This person is this, and this, right? And Alan once told me, he said, you know, people will actually really surprise you. And I'm like, bullshit, right? But when I actually took it seriously, I was like, oh, okay, I can actually see that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you would call this defensive pessimism in this context. Maybe defensive optimism. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just imagine, oh, if that person, like, for example, if you think, oh, this person is an asshole because they don't contact me or something like that,
right,
often for whatever reason.
Yeah.
It's possible that that's the case. Sure. Maybe they're not thinking of you. So of course you can sort of call them that, right? But it could also be, oh, maybe they're going through something. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe something else is going on in their life that's monopolizing their attention.
Right.
Maybe they do actually care about you, and that way that you want them to reach out to you isn't the way that they're used to reaching out to somebody. It's not something they resonate with,
right,
but they do actually, if asked, would say positive things about you. And I think of all these little different possibilities. So this way I'm not married to necessarily one. I mean, this is kind of goes with my thing with ego, right? If I'm married to a certain belief about somebody, I will then, you know, go on that path, and perhaps a negative result may come from it. and maybe having, not assumed that I know for a fact, what's going on in this person's head, allows enough sort of mystery for us to then maybe communicate instead of me have to assume what's going on. And then maybe that'll take us down a more positive path and avoid any unnecessary disagreements or any sort of rupture in the relationship.
Right. But again, it's just so much easier to do it otherwise, to tell yourself, no, I know what this person is going to do, because this way I won't be hurt.
Exactly. No, this is great. This is a great conversation. First of all, I have two things to say. One is that this is what you're talking about is a basic aspect of what I would think of as critical thinking, right? Somebody does something, you either like it or don't like it, whatever, you're observing it. If you leap to, this is why I don't like them, or this is, then you've immediately ignored this kind of, well, let's wait a minute. What are the possible explanations for this? Which is most likely? Are the other explanations still also likely? And so on. So that's basic critical thinking. That's like, you don't leap to a conclusion. You first stop and try to determine what are the other plausible hypotheses for what has just happened, right? And so that's that. And the other thing is that when we're talking these examples, we're thinking about other people, right? When we think about other people, there's this thing in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. When it comes to someone out there doing something, for example, that we don't like, we immediately think that that's part of their nature. That's a trait that they show. He's always doing that, right? He always hands in his work late, right? Whereas if it happens to us, the exact same thing, then suddenly all the environmental impacts, I was sick that day, my car broke down, and all those sort of situational factors come to the fore, and we attribute the same action to that kind of thing rather. So I think it's important to recognize that those situational factors are real, and they might be applying to this other person as well, right? But it is true that and I think this is part of the reason we think that this way, is that in a system one sort of way, it's easier just to say, oh, that's him, right? That's a trait. That's the way he is or she is or whatever. And so I love this. It's a great example.
Right. Yeah, it sort of acts as a confidence preservation mechanism, right? So you can feel certain about the world, more secure.
Yeah.
But I always doubt my initial impulses either about a person or a situation, only because anytime I've ever assumed before, it just, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's right, and then most times it's not correct. So just letting it be sort of a mystery, not necessarily putting a label.
Yep.
I don't know. I also find sometimes I project also my own thoughts or feelings onto others.
Why do you think you do that?
Why? Why? I feel like it's sort of an innate thing.
Yeah.
So because I've noticed that's why I sort of doubt that impulse.
And now thinking about it, just applying the concept of the fundamental attribution error, you know what I'm thinking? I wonder if the rigidity is actually based in that, where for me, it's easy to say, okay, you know what? This person is a bad friend, or just like a bad girlfriend or a bad person, because this way, if it's situational, it's like, oh shit, but that could be about me.
Exactly. Or it's just more work, like I can depend on the person, or I can expect certain things of the person under these environments, but are those present or not? And it is easier to just do it the other way. But yeah, it's a problem. The business about projecting onto other people, there's also a thing in social psychology called the false consensus effect, where you just assume that other people around you have similar views on an issue. And we've all, I think, encountered cases, especially in our political world, where that can be a mistake, where you assume that someone sees a political issue the same way you do, and quickly you're corrected on that. So.
Right. Right. So then in terms of personality, how do we begin to kind of move away from that concept? Like if we know fully, right? Because I mean, I'm thinking about it. For me, like the rigidity, I think is important, obviously, because it helps me get a sense of safety or feel safe in potential relationships or move away from scary ones. But what can we do to sort of move away from that construct and not think about it so rigidly and so kind of, or be so enmeshed in it?
Well, I mean, I think part of the message of the book is that you shouldn't. I mean, in other words, in a relationship that you think is based on trust, it's probably important to keep the delusion that this person is always going to be trustworthy and so forth. And and so I'm not necessarily one. And by the way, this delusion and one other, at least, or two other in the book, are pretty universal, right? This is not just certain people. Like as in the case of defensive pessimism, only certain people have that. But so this seems to be pretty universal, and I wouldn't necessarily just distract it. But I do think that there are benefits. First of all, I mean, I think critical thinking is important in terms of, stepping back, especially when you're about to criticize someone. Right. You're about to have a bad thought about somebody or criticize someone. I think that's the moment when you should catch yourself and say, well, wait a second, what are some of the other possibilities for why this happened? And that's just decent critical thinking. But otherwise, I don't think I have any real suggestion about it. I do think that there's a benefit in that. I'm always drawn to the issue of punishment or criticism or some kind of negative attribution. Because there's where it seems like we could really make a mistake and we could do some harm. Like if you give somebody extra praise when they don't really deserve it or something like that, I don't see any great harm in that. But when you're going to do the opposite, then and one of the things about this viewpoint, the sort of malleableness of personality viewpoint, is that it puts your focus not on the person but on the environment that they're in, and so in some ways it lets you off the hook. It doesn't mean that if you break the law we're not going to punish you, right? Or that there aren't going to be situations where you need to push people away because you can't trust them anymore or something like that. But it does mean that your assessment of the situation is less of a lasting sort of personality or character criticism of the person, and more of a, this person is just not in a place in their life where I can embrace them in the same way. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's probably a more honest assessment than our sort of pigeonholing people with labels.
Right. And sorry, and also just connected to that, what you were just saying about praise not having that much harm. I mean, I think we underestimate sometimes how much of an impact we really can have on somebody's personality. Like a lot of times we think that all right, this person, like you just said, we put a label on somebody and we think that's who they are and that's it. And if it's something we deem negative, we try to stay away from them. If it's positive, we try to get closer. But then there's things that we can do, right? I mean, for example, people like to or tend to stay congruent to what they believe is their identity. So, I mean, arguably speaking, if in your interactions with somebody, say it be a friend or an acquaintance, you sort of say things like, oh, you seem like a friendly person. I mean, this is a little basic, maybe not quite as basic as that, but maybe if you sort of craft an identity for them in a sense, like you have this trait, you have that trait, they may actually try to stay congruent to that in your interactions with them.
Right.
And that could also steer things in a positive way, as opposed to saying something negative about them, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah. I think in the positive domain, there is some evidence to support that if you give that positive feedback in a trait-like way, right, that they may, that children, for example, you're a good worker, you're a hard worker, that kind of thing can be beneficial.
Right. And I think that this is going to take us now into the free will topic. But I think what you're I think what you're saying is that essentially, as best as we can, because obviously we can't have a fully, kind of complicated or nuanced view of all of the factors involved. But I think what you're saying is when you're thinking of a person's judgments, decisions, etc., what you should be taking into account is their particular habits, whether or not you want to call it personality or traits or whatever. But let's say their tendencies, dispositions, whatever, and then you take into consideration, again, you're not going to have a full account of what's going on in their lives, but as best as you can, a full understanding of what the actual factors are around them, right? Sort of their circumstances. So if you're taking these together, what you're essentially saying, okay, is that maybe most of the time they're going to have these traits and dispositions or tendencies, but in this particular case or that particular case, factors are going to be so overwhelming that they're going to choose otherwise based on, like, let's say other particular, desires, goals, whatever, right? Maybe even, particular genes that they've kind of inherited too. So in thinking about it this way, how should then we think about free will, right? Because free will is the ultimate delusion, right? It's the ultimate illusion, delusion, whatever. This is something that's fundamental to all of us. When people argue about free will, they tend to get incredibly offended and defensive about it. So when we think about free will, right, how can we think about it in a way that's both obviously, or if we can, and both in a way that's sort of truthful, but then also in a way that's helpful to us in the kind of social environment to help us adapt, survive, and thrive?
That's great. Well, of course, this is the big one, right? I saved this one to the very end of the book, hoping that I would draw people along and they would, give me some credibility. And then when I hit them with the hard one, that they'd be ready.
Yeah.
So I think this is this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, actually, because I had an interest in this before I got the idea to write the book, and I did teach a class on the illusion of conscious will, on free will, and I used a book by Daniel Wegner called The Illusion of Conscious Will as the main text, and it's a great book, and basically I make several arguments in the book for suggesting that first of all, two claims that I make. One is that our sense of consciously, doing things is an illusion or a delusion, but that's the second is that it's useful to us in a number of ways. And so I mean, the evidence for the first claim that it's a delusion, there's several. I mean, and this has been debated since the beginning of time, right? Philosophers and psychologists and others. So first of all, I make a sort of a logical argument, which is that if you think about the grand scheme of the universe, right, the galaxies in space and everything, the planets, we don't have any problem thinking of that as being completely deterministic, atoms, molecules, chemistry, physics, billiard balls going where they want to go, or where they're going. We don't think about a galaxy like the reason it's going off into that corner of the universe is because it's curious about what's over there, right? We don't do that, right? That's not a problem. And even here on Earth, most of what we encounter, we don't attribute any choice or will, to what they're doing. It's somewhere between us and earthworms, plants, nothing. The large number of animal species on the planet, we do not attribute free will to them. Maybe our dogs and cats, some other species, dolphins or something, I don't, primates, but certain primates, but somewhere there's a line that's drawn, and somehow the rules are special in those cases. That somehow there's this idea of a non-material, will or object that is somehow that's deciding, right, and is somehow affecting a material object, and that's the problem of dualism, right? The idea that you have a non-material chooser, right? It's deciding. It could do either thing, anything. It can do whatever it wants, and it makes us physically do things, and that's just to me, when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, that there would be these special rules just for these tiny, on this one planet over here, just us. That seems implausible to me. It seems more like a religious belief than a scientifically defensible one. So that's one logical argument. The other part of it is that there's a new and sort of interesting field that's developed called experimental philosophy. And it's actually philosophers usually just argued and reasoned, right? That's how they did their work. They would just argue with each other and try to work it out. But these folks are philosophers, but they're actually doing experiments, and they're getting at the way in which normal people reason about problems through collecting data, very much like psychologists. And one of the things that comes out of that research is that when you think about somebody doing something, your judgment of whether they had a choice or not, right, is strongly influenced by whether you want to make them morally responsible for that act. So for example, and this, I just talked about this the other day, and it's on Friday in another talk, and it's extremely timely at the moment. But one study that shows this is a case where people were brought into the lab and read a little scenario, and the scenario was about a woman who had become pregnant. She goes to the doctors, and she discovers that, according to the doctor, that the fetus has some kind of a problem, and she would have to go on a special diet throughout the pregnancy. And if she doesn't, the fetus will die within a month, right? So she goes home, she begins to think about it, and she says, come to think of it, I'm not sure I'm ready to have a child. I'm not sure I could be a good parent. This isn't the right time for me. So she doesn't go on the diet, and the fetus does die within a month. Now they asked participants, did Sarah, this is the name of that they gave the woman, did she allow the fetus to die, or did she make the fetus die? And of course, they also asked people beforehand whether they were pro-life or pro-choice, right? And what happened, predictably, is that the pro-choice people said she allowed the fetus to die. The pro-life participants said she made the fetus die, right? So obviously they would have had a more severe moral judgment on what Sarah chose to do. But one of the main objections to discarding free will as a real concept, one of the main objections to it is that people think that we need it in order to make moral judgments about people, right? And if you didn't choose to do it, if you were compelled to do it, that's different, and so forth. And so I understand that, but whether we have free will or not is sort of a factual question. We either have it or we don't, right? And of course we use it in moral judgments and in punishment and reward and so on, but that's secondary, right? That doesn't have a bearing on whether it's true or not. And so that's one of the things. That's why, for example, the largest group of philosophers are what they call compatibilists, which means that they accept that determinism is real, but somehow they think that free will in humans is not incompatible with that. I've never been able to quite get my head around how that would be possible, but that's their view. And if I'm not going on too long, I will tell you the last argument,
please,
which is that, as individuals, our only evidence that we have free will is a feeling.
Right.
We feel like we're doing things, right? And it's very subjective, and I feel like I'm, deciding to move my hand like this and so forth, And the problem is that feeling is highly unreliable. And this is where Daniel Wegner, in his book, he talks about many situations in which you can be fooled into thinking you're doing something when you're not, right? Like he gave an example of going into a toy store, and a video game is there. He grabs the joystick and he starts playing the game and making the monkey jump up and down or whatever it was that's going on. And then all of a sudden, start game flashes up on the screen, and he realizes that he thought he was actually making the monkey move because he was doing the joystick thing, and he had nothing to do with it. It was playing. It was in demo mode, and it was going all on. So that's believing that you're doing when you're not, right? And then there's the Ouija board case, where if you're playing on an Ouija board, you're obviously making it move, but you don't believe you are. You don't feel you are, because there are two people involved and it's unclear as to what's going on and so forth. And there are many other examples. He did laboratory studies that showed many cases where he could fool you in either direction, either to believing you're doing something when you're not, or to believe you're not doing something when your body is in fact doing it. And once you look at that data and realize that, we're depending upon a subjective feeling for our belief in this thing, then you realize, and as a psychologist, of course, I'm very much aware of how we can be fooled in these different ways. I mean, superstition itself, which was my first topic that I first worked on, is a case of an illusion of control, right? You think that by doing this superstition, it's going to have an outcome. So,
right.
So those are my arguments. Not everyone will be convinced, but I think for me, it's a tough lift to suggest that somehow we have this non-material thing that's doing it.
Yeah, and I love the argument that you bring up against facilitated communication. And so, for those who don't know, facilitated communication was a popular, I don't know if I guess you would still call it treatment. So it was a popular treatment, with quotes,
yes.
Treatment model for autistic children or people just in general. And the idea was essentially, once it was sort of debunked, I mean, people were devastated by it because they've invested so much time, money, kind of energy into it. And then, so I would wonder, in connecting this to just the broad concept of free will, how come you think, first of all, I mean, facilitated communication is a little bit more obvious because, again, so much was invested into it. But how come you think it's so devastating for people to kind of admit, or at least consider, the fact that free will may not actually be what you think it is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the case of the facilitated communication, it meant the difference between a person being an intelligent speaking person, right? And them not. And so these people had come to believe. And by the way, I will tell you that it's not gone away. It's come back stronger than ever before, and there are different versions of it now. But that's the appeal, right? Is that and for a parent, think about it. Your child has never said "I love you" in their whole life. They have nothing at all has been really come and so suddenly now they're speaking and writing full sentences and so on. So that's why it was so devastating. But I do think that it's a cultural thing. I mean, it's a strong cultural force. I mean, in a weird way, Christianity historically has struggled with it, right? Because on the one hand, according to some views, you had to behave in a certain way in order to get into heaven, to get the reward, right? And yet at the same time, God is supposed to be all-knowing, right? Omniscient. So like God knows where you're going to make it or not anyway, right? And it's just sort of like, how can those two things be true? Free will seemed to be necessary for people to do, and for example, to do bad things, right? And so that, and then we do. I mean, part of the reason why I think it's so ingrained is based in its usefulness. It is the issue of being able to control other people, to make judgments about other people, because we're an intensely social species. We are, infants cannot survive without someone else at birth, and we work in groups, right? We have to have work in social groups, and so the ability to control other people's behavior, the group being able to control individuals' behavior, is very, very important. And that feeling that I did something, right? So in other words, let's say that you do something for the first time, you feel that you've done it, right? Not somebody else. And then you get punished for that, or rewarded, either way, really. Then when you do that act again and feel yourself doing it again, that history of reward or punishment is going to become to the fore, and it will affect your behavior later on. So I think that we've established this. I mean, we actually have evolved this for important reasons. Also, just on a basic level, I give an example in the book the steering wheel, right? Like where you're driving down the highway, you have your hands on the steering wheel, and the steering wheel turns to the right, and you go off the road, right? Well, if you were the one who did that, that's different than if it just did it on its own. And so being able to, and there are many situations in which our body might move, right, for various reasons. And being able to know that you didn't do it yourself, it didn't come from you, it came from somewhere else. Just that simple discrimination is of great value to us. So I think there are practical but also social reasons why we have this feeling, and it has been used over time to help us survive.
Right. But I also think on top of that, it seems like a lot of people have a misconception of what we mean by, well, not even we, I'm not a philosopher. So, but what people mean by determinism, I think they think of it as it's okay. It's either the universe controlling me or some external force, or it's me being able to control myself, right? It's sort of like these two extremes where it's either, again, it's the universe sort of whatever, however you want to call it, right? Your universe, I don't know, the cosmos or whatnot. It's sort of like I'm being sort of imposed on, as opposed to free will, where it's like, well, I'm free to make a decision, right? Like libertarianism. But that's from what your argument is that's not the actual right way to think about determinism or even compatibilism, if that's what we're thinking about. It's not so much that there's an external force upon us. That's not actually determinism. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What do you actually mean by when you say free will doesn't exist? So what is it that?
Well, so I think that from a psychologist's point of view, in simple terms, what we're doing right now, whatever you're doing at any given moment, is a feature of a number of things. Obviously, you have a genetic inheritance. You have certain abilities that you've acquired through your genes and the process of evolution. You also have a long learning history. I'm 70 years old now, so I have a long history of various experiences, and I've learned and adapted my my lifespan for that. And then finally, there's the situation you're in right now, right, which is drawing upon both those other forces. And I think that when it comes to our sense of free will, when we're being affected by very weak forces, right, like where there are parts of our history that would pull us in one direction or another, right, and it depends on where we are in that moment, and that's when you're most likely to feel free, right? Whereas if you're being compelled in one way or another, and we are often in many situations, like there's really no choice, I have to do this, I'm going to do this because I don't have any alternative. You don't have the same feeling. You don't have the same, you're under the sway of a more powerful force at that moment, and you just do what you have to do. And so I think that between those, the various aspects of what you're doing, I mean, for example, yawning, right? Like, so yawning, is that free will? I don't know.
Seems like it isn't.
Coughing, right? Is that free will? Did I, not so much, right? You're kind of compelled, and you don't feel like it is. But choosing what to put in your next sandwich, well, okay, I could go this way, I could go that way. It depends on how I'm feeling today. Those are the situations. Again, I would suggest to you that that's all to some extent deterministic, based on your long history, what's available in the situation, and so forth. But your feeling of freedom is likely to be much stronger in that case, because you're under the sway of sort of a lot of competing, relatively weak influences.
Oh,
does
interesting.
that help?
Yeah, so just to kind of try to conceptualize it, so is what you're saying is that, like, let's say hypothetically, if there was an addict, right? So an addict would say, well, like, you don't understand how like significant or how strong the temptation is, right? It doesn't feel like I have the will to put it down, like whatever, your drug of choice is cigarettes, alcohol, whatever, right? So it's like, it doesn't feel like I'm able to. But when it comes to, like, let's say coffee, right? It's like, when I'm thinking of what should I choose like a latte or a macchiato? Well, I mean, probably one desire is going to outweigh the other, but it's like our perceptual abilities can't actually tell which one outweighs the other, right? So it's like we can't say that this desire is sort of like here's the tipping point, right? It's like the macchiato seems to like, be more significant than the latte or the desire for it. But because we can't tell, it seems like what we're thinking is that, it means that we must be able to choose. Whereas let's say if I had a deep desire for the macchiato and I really was like, oh, the latte seems like a poor choice, it would feel like there's something inside of me that's pulling me toward it as opposed to my own volition. Is that it?
Exactly. And so, for example, in the case of the addict, first of all, we can credit him or her as being, we understand that we would accept that as being valid, that they don't feel as though they have a choice. Right. And secondly, we kind of figure out how they got there, right? We understand what that is. But many of the other choices we make in life are ones where, we're no longer in touch with what's causing it. And there are also things that, your choice of a macchiato versus a regular coffee or something can be as simple as like the color in the room at that moment, and you may be completely unaware, right? And or some smell that just hits you that you're not aware of it, but it's influencing you.
Or memory.
Exactly. So those are the situations where you're going to feel like you're making a choice. But I would suggest that to some degree, they're just as determined as others. It's just that it's for the observer, it's less obvious that that's the case.
My God, I love that. And I really love just how the book is structured. I like that you go from, these sort of everyday or kind of mundane sort of illusions or delusions, and then it goes right into free will where you're like, wow, holy shit, where did that even come from?
Exactly. I know. Yeah. And then I feel like I need to get out of town after that chapter because I've pushed it as far as I can. So but I'm glad you like the book. I'm really, really happy to hear that you responded to it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I would say it's out of all of the books in 2022. I mean, obviously, we're still in June, but I would say it's one of my top 5 books of the year so far.
That's
for
great.
Me as well. Yeah.
That's an honor. That's really great. I'm so happy to hear that. I tell you, it was, I don't know if you could tell from the book itself, but this is like my 4th or 5th book I think I've written in. And this one by far was more personal. And I felt I had a deeper feeling as I was writing. It was a pleasure to write, and I felt as though I was making a sort of a different kind of contribution by writing it than I had in my previous book. So I hope that came through for you, and it was an enjoyable read as well as something that you learned from.
Yeah, and what I love the most about it is that it wasn't your typical self-help book. It wasn't like, oh, hey, how to overcome system 1 thinking, which obviously has its values. I'm not saying that's bad, but I like the different perspective because for me, if anything, I actually struggle with empathizing with, what we would consider human nature. So I have such a and it's funny that I mentioned this toward the end of the podcast because maybe this could have been an interesting conversation, but I have such a deep disdain of irrationality that for me, it's like, it's so hard to think of it like in a sort of productive or beneficial way.
Yeah. And I want to connect to that. So ever since I've known you, right, I've felt that, and it's actually kind of rubbed off on me in some ways. in some ways, I've actually made an attempt to sort of dissolve any delusions I had about the world or life. But what I love about your book and what I connected to in your book is that there are actually there is a rationality to using delusion in the sense of being able to feel more fulfilled, or there's a practical use to delusion. Right. And it's something that couldn't have come to me in a better time because I've actually started to once again try to sort of embrace delusional thinking too, but in a sense of
like pragmatically.
Yeah, exactly. Because I tried being incredibly rational, but then it kind of took the spice a little bit out of life.
It does.
That I once had. Right?
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's all your fault.
I ruined his life.
No, I kid, of course, but no, but what's great is that your book kind of gives me the confidence to sort of embrace that again, because I was trying to dance between rationality and delusion, and then seeing that there are uses to some ways of delusional thinking. It's actually it's nice to see. It's refreshing, actually.
Right. It's like it doesn't make you stupid or foolish to sort of engage in them, because the idea is that they're natural. And it's like, in some way, I mean, the reason why they're natural is because they're evolutionarily adaptive. I mean, we wouldn't have evolved them otherwise.
I started to sort of go towards a sort of black and white kind of way of thinking about it. I used to be not incredibly delusional. I tried to be rational.
I hope
not incredibly, but with a little bit of rationality. And now I feel like I'm finding that balance thanks to your book. So
that's exactly the process I went through as well. I mean, in the sense that I was always, skeptical and rational and all of that. And it was very freeing and sort of welcome to be able to say, hey, wait a second, like, let's be honest about it. For these cases, not everything. And of course, we're in a world right now where some people feel there's no truth, there's nothing, and things are very crazy. So I was very self-conscious about that as I wrote the book. But just to be factual about it, there are certain kinds of ways in which something that wouldn't be strictly rational has practical value for those individuals. And so this is an attempt to sort of reconcile that and acknowledge that this is fact. That's why I come back to the Odysseus and the complicated people that we are at the end of the book.
Oh, by the way, because I actually really love that. And it's interesting that we're coming back to the beginning. So can you tell us a little bit about how the Odysseus story is pertinent, especially in relation to the Achilles one in Troy?
Yeah, well, on a personal level, I read her translation over the pandemic, which I thought was wonderful. And she's writing a translation now of the Iliad, which will come out, I think, next year. But he's a person who changes, adapts to his environment, right? There's a whole question about whether Odysseus, as he goes through all these challenges to get back home, he just wants to get home to his wife and son, that he has to lie a lot, and he has to do all these things. There's a point at which you begin to believe that he lies more than he even needs to, right? And so the question then becomes, is he a good person or not? If he succeeded, and in that sense, that's a judgment that is positive, I suppose, but is he actually a good person or not? And so what the basic idea here was, I have complicated my own view of human behavior by writing this book. And I thought that was a useful thing to say. And the idea of survival, right? In other words, Odysseus does succeed and gets home, right? And so that is, to me, wasn't analogous to evolution, right? Evolution doesn't care, has absolutely no stake in whether we're rational or not, right? Natural selection just is a process of getting to the next day, right? And so I recognize that, and that's part of the sort of pragmatic view of the book. I talk about William James at the beginning of the book. William James had he wanted to sort of allow for belief in the afterlife and in religious belief. And one of his justifications for that was that there are tangible benefits now for some people for those beliefs. And so that sort of pragmatic view is part of what is in the book as well. And I think Odysseus sort of characterized the dilemma of that for me in a nice way.
Right. And it was interesting that in terms of like that kind of dichotomy, that you have Odysseus as the bad guy because he's like a shapeshifter, and then Achilles is the good guy because he's kind of remained the same. But it's not really that. It's much more complicated than that. Again, situations are important. And if anything, for Achilles, from what I remember about the book, there wasn't much change. So there wasn't like this big trial and where he had to overcome all of these different obstacles. It was just like, well, he went to war. I mean, that's kind of what he always does. And he was like the same soldier that he always has been, because most of what he does is literally just go from one war to the next, whereas Odysseus had these different trials, like kind of like an underworld journey where he had to beat, like, if you're into video games, like different bosses.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, that's right. And there was, I mentioned that I think Plato had to defend Socrates, I'm sorry, had to defend whether which of them was the better person. And it was a tough sell on Odysseus. So anyway, yeah, I'm glad you responded to that. That seemed to be for me, it seemed to be a perfect way to sum up and end the book. And it's always nice to go back to classic literature when you can.
Absolutely, with so much to teach us. So, right, Alan, final questions for Stuart before we wrap up?
Yes, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, where could we find you?
Well, I have a very unusual name, Stuart Vyse, STUARTVYSE. And so I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and I have a website as well, stuartvyse.com. So it's pretty easy to find me. Just put the name in the Google machine and it'll come out.
Excellent. Stuart, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, you guys. Great questions and much good discussion. So thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, great.
Bye.
All right. I have no idea how much time passed.
I didn't even look. I didn't
look once. So everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and on Twitter at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
And thank you guys so much for watching, and see you next time.